welcome back to Inside.net. It's myself, Rodney, and Cecil, and we have a guest with us today. Some of you may know him. I first encountered him on the Cake Project. He actually he gave me feedback and merged my first pull request ever on GitHub. Currently a member of the .NET Foundation board, all-around stand-up guy, and OSS contributor, Matthias Carlson.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And today, we're going to kind of start with trolling the internet, as I tend to do. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm technically an internet troll. But today's topic is about application versioning, and specifically came from this tweet. Isaac Levin, another great community member, asked the question around long-term support. Who's going to migrate to .NET 7 when there's no long-term support? What does .NET 8 look like in terms of long-term support? And it spawned this conversation. And this conversation is going to kind of be broadcasted more or less live today between us and Matthias, because it brought up a lot of questions for me around, what's the purpose of moving? How much pain is it to move a web application these days? Because I haven't moved a web application, truth be told, in some years, because I've been working on Xamarin. So, what does the support model look like from a consumer consuming .NET? I have an application in .NET, long-term support. How do I stay in the long-term support window, right? And continue to make sure that my application deploys without, catastrophic system failures. So this tweet kind of spawned this whole conversation, and yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about, right? Where there's the concept of bleeding edge technology, right? So we constantly talk about this bleeding edge of technology, and everyone talks about it. And all the bosses that I've had in my life have talked about it from, hey, we want to stay away from the bleeding edge where it's safe. Well, there's two edges of this bleeding edge sword, right? There's the front edge where you can get cut and take the bump and put a Band-Aid on it, get some stitches and move on. And then there's the back edge, which in my opinion tends to be a little bit more blunt, a lot more hard to manage, and things start to fester a little bit worse as a result of the wound. So it becomes a question of how do we keep our applications in line with Microsoft's newer long-term support model. You get away from the concept of this legacy space that we've all known for, anyone who's been in the .NET space for 10 years or more. We know about this space where, .NET never falls out of support. So this new world where .NET is deploying at a consistent cadence and encouraging you to keep up in your long-term support model, in its practices, what does that look like? And Matthias had a very interesting response to that and said that he does it no problem with his applications. So I figured we'd get him here and we'd have him tell us, what does that look like in his world? How does he go about ensuring that he's on the bleeding edge without getting cut, without worrying about any of the problems that come with, as we all know, a new version of a Microsoft product is likely going to break the application. So we brought him on today to give us his take on how that works.
Yeah, and in a way, I think sometimes the safe place you're talking about is an illusion. It's more of a construct where someone's like, if I only stand on the long-term support, I'm safe. But in reality, you will get the security update each month. That's the cadence of .NET. If you look at .NET 6 or .NET 3.1 core, you got an update each month that you need to update to. So that's sometimes people think if I just pin my version and then I can stay safe for 3 years. But in reality, especially if you work like me, often in the cloud and containers and serverless or something like that, you need to sometimes if you have a little pain each day, you won't get to the cliff moment where I see if you only every 3 years, because they could be if you have a little pain each day, then your product can live for a long period of time. So you will do both version 1, 2, and 3 and not end up I see so many projects where they don't take care of the dependencies. And essentially they end up to either the big rewrite, or we will have the like 6 months of going through updates. So that's why like sometimes I think the safe place mentality somehow is an illusion with today's, like with all security threats and everything that happens. You need to stay on top of things. And it all depends on what stacks you're using, because it can be more complex. Like if you're using something like Azure Functions, or if you use something like Xamarin or the new Maui things, those can be sometimes tied to specific .NET version, so the tooling isn't there. So then it can be hard, but there's still these point releases that you should update to. And especially if you do things like since .NET 3.1, .NET Core 3.1, and now .NET 5 and 6 and on, you can have the sense of self-contained applications where you ship the framework with your application. That means it's your responsibility to keep that up to date. Previously, when you had just the .NET framework on your machine that was versioned and supported with Windows, then you got service through Windows Update. So you didn't know about those things, and the support lifecycle of those was tied to Windows. So essentially, that's why some of the .NET framework, classic desktop, have so long support, is because, well, in the beginning, Windows had 10-year support. If you see Windows 11, it has 3-year support, so it's shorter, and you see that it goes to shorter life cycles. But there are also things like, if you say SQL Server that has .NET 3.5, or that kept the .NET 3.5 living longer than 4.0. So it can be sometimes tied to products. But I mean, sometimes I think you need to keep your dependencies checked because ransomware or being attacked or all this. So sometimes it's an illusion that you don't have to care for 3 years. You still have to care every month.
Right.
Yeah, what I was thinking, and I like the point that you make about how the culture of .NET has kind of changed, right? Like we went from the, hey, I'm just going to get it to Windows updates, to now, oh, okay, I actually have to go download the thing itself, right? And I got to go set it up and install. I got to do work now, right?
Uh-huh.
And I say that the culture because, again, as .NET developers, sometimes we just kind of got used to things just automatically happening. And we're like, oh, look, there's a point release and a point 2 release and a point whatever release. And we don't really, for most folks, you don't really think about it as much. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so now I'm wondering, in this new world, I think how we handle versioning is such a complex thing. I really didn't think about it until 10 minutes ago, to be very honest with you. But it's depending on the type of applications you build, the world looks different for you. What happens if you're a NuGet package maintainer? Now I'm targeting multiple versions, right? What happens if I'm a mobile developer, or if I'm, if I have this monolithic application that, we're not going to update this anytime soon, but I just need to keep, the lights on kind of thing. All of these things are different perspectives as to what versioning actually means to me. And at some point in time, we're going to have our own specific strategy in our organization to try and figure that out,
Yeah, but it also comes down to me as I'm usually investing in the DevOps space and how to keep things there. And what I learned is if something's usually is people's instinct when there's friction, they want to stay away from it because there's pain. Yeah. But sometimes if you grind with something, it will become smooth. So if you keep working on the friction, it will become less work. I know when I was when I was in the army many decades ago, it was really hard to make your bed each morning and do the exercise routine, but it become everyday life because we did it every day. So I think sometimes it's by habits, and that's why it's a culture shift within .NET, because now where we have Linux and they have macOS and multi-platform support, it's a totally different landscape. And also things you can't assume that things are on the operating system anymore. There were one of the big problems when migrating application was that it was so tied to Windows that people expected certain things to be there. And then you start an Alpine container and there's nothing there except your runtime. And you don't even have a certificate store and things like that. So it can be, there's a culture shift in that area. So I think that can be a hard thing. But there are also been culture shifts within .NET where we had the whole .NET standard thing, we had the PCL things, so there's also been generations like you notice that, like for me, the easiest thing was to multi-target instead of doing .NET Standard, because I wanted to take advantage of as much as possible. I don't like the problem like with me doing a lot of audits security-wise is that people don't know which implicit dependencies they get if they don't have a specific target, because there's been different, like .NET Standard was one thing, but there was different things you got from each platform and things like that. So there's one thing if you have the framework moniker, which is .NET 6 or .NET 7 or .NET 5 or .NET Core 3.1. That's one thing, but the SDK and the runtime is a separate thing that you need to service separately. And that's why they have things like the global JSON file that you can have in your repository to pin to, like, this was the SDK I used to build this software. And there you can set things like I allow rolling forward locally to a new version or something like that. But also there's things where I find like if you are in a container world where you have divided your applications into multiple containers, then you can, like, I already have some, like what people don't know, like with .NET 7 RC1 now, you actually have a go live license. So you're supported to have that in production. That doesn't mean that you should change everything to production, but you can actually ease it into, like if you have, well, I have that background worker, or I can have 10% on a load if you have some kind of thing. So you can actually, because there's so much that when there's like a new major version, it's good to quickly get the knowledge within your team, how to like build this new SDK, are there any differences, and how to release my software, are there any differences, and things like that. And if you start small and get that knowledge within your team, then it's not so big jump for the next thing. And I think if you have that mentality that you like continuously at least try and test with the new things, then you can have, before things go out to support, you have the knowledge to what actions I need to take, and you can steer it to, well, you should use this library instead, or this feature instead in the future. Yeah. And also that's why, like, they have like the SDS with the short time support with this, which is well, now it will be the odd numbers like 7 and 5 and 3, and they have the long term support, which is 6 and 8 and 3.1 was the before previously, But if you like see the reality, like .NET 6 got an update September 14th. So it's, I mean, and it was released, so it gets an update each month because there's security things. There's like now we have a web server that someone put on internet, like you want it to be as secure as possible. There's also SDK fixes. So there are like things that are fixed in the build pipeline. And so I think that's why, like, sometimes I say it's an illusion that you don't have to, like, oh, I will just use this SDK for the next 3 years, and that's not what they support. They support you if you have the latest security patch version, and if you are containerized, then you can easily try out like .NET 7 by switching which container you're running from. And usually, when you have containers, you have one SDK which you build. You one build and one runtime container, essentially, where you put in things. And not all know this, but you can actually switch the runtime container to have a .NET 7 runtime container, even if you're building it. And you can set a couple of environment variables which allows things to forcibly roll over, which means you can see, like, can I use RDN, like if I do an integration test with my binaries, will it still work with the new runtime? So that's one test. Then you can test if I build my code, because there's two different parts there. Because sometimes there can be developer experience features that you get with new SDK, even if you're targeting the old moniker. So there's twofold, like one, what am I running my code on, and what is my developer experience. And often, like as soon as in November, Visual Studio will ship with .NET 7, so you will get the new SDK. So you can actually get build errors just by upgrading to the new Visual Studio, because you're partly using the new SDK.
You brought up a very good point that I kind of want to go back to, right? So there's this concept of .NET. There's a .NET version, right? Then there's a framework moniker. There's also a runtime and an SDK, right? So for me, who doesn't understand that language, like, what are the differences between those? How do they operate together? And as somebody that's deploying something to a container, what do I have to pay attention to? Like, why does that matter to me?
Well, what matters is like when you, especially in Containerland, if you ship something, you want to ship as little code as possible, and that's why you ship the runtime plus your binaries. So you want something, because if you ship the full SDK, essentially, if that was a problem before with Windows, because you actually had a C# compiler in your System32 like directory. So if someone for any reason would get into your container, you want them to have as little tools as possible to do anything that matters. And if you have a complete programming environment, then you can make new DLLs and ship things, and so that's. But you also want things to be, well, I want to deploy as quickly as possible, so I want something slim that's as few megabytes as possible to ship. So you have a runtime, and there you have, like in .NET now, you have two concepts. Either you pick a runtime container from Microsoft, which is pre-made, when you just add your binaries, or you pick as like a smallest Linux container you can find with the native dependencies, and you build something called self-contained, where it's just your application and the parts of the runtime you need. So that's the runtime part. The SDK is what you use to build your code. And that's that has the .NET CLI, it has the C# compiler, it has all like framework references and things like that. So you can use like a newer version of the .NET SDK to build an older version, like a target framework. So you can build .NET 6 applications with .NET 7 SDK. You can't do the opposite. You can't build, but you still need like the reference assemblies and things like that. So that's something you can use. So usually when you have container, you use multi-parts. You have one part where I build my code, which is like a builder container, and then a runtime container, which you copy over those pre-built binaries from the ship. So you get a smaller container with less security, for instance. And you can always rebuild, and you have the new container, or you can like have a specific tag which on version 2. So usually some say like I will do the .NET 6 .x, and I will have the latest. Or if there's some troubles, then I can pin it to a specific version also. So that there's the difference. Like something has the complete tooling to build software, the others is just to run your code, which is the runtime.
A lot of times when I think about things from the perspective of, let's say I'm a new .NET person, right? Like I just got here and I'm like, you know what? Like I have some code I want to share with people. And I come to the docs and I see like all of these version things and TFMs and acronyms and all kinds of stuff. And I'm like, hey, I just want to share some code. Which one of these things do I really need to target or focus on? Like what do I point my code at to like push it, right? And so for me, sometimes I can imagine that it's probably a little bit overwhelming for a lot of folks to try and figure out, well, like, what's the right combination of things for me to do? All depending on the type of app I'm trying to build. And even for me, like I was trying to publish a package the other day, and I was like, oh man, like should I target standard 2.0? Is it 2.1, which I think is a thing? There's 7 RC, there's 6, there's 5. Oh, but like 6 is going to be out of support in 2 years, so I have some time. Maybe I should stick on 6 and I shouldn't pay attention to 7. Or 3.1 is going to be out of support in December of this year, December of 2022. Maybe I should just completely ignore 3.1, right? And then just target 6 and 7, right? And so I can see for people how it's just like, hey, I just want to target a thing and then forget about it, right? Because I'm not in the business of versioning the framework. I'm in the business of writing code, and I just want to do that, right? Yeah. So for someone that was going to come in today and say, hey, I just want to publish some stuff, right? Like what are some strategies, or what are some things that they should think about as they're choosing, like what's the target I should choose?
Yeah. And that's like, I'm a consultant, so I will always say it depends, but it's
I know it.
But I mean, I would say it depends on your audience, because there's one thing, like if your team builds something, then you have like, it's an internal thing. I can pick the moniker that fits my team. Sure. But if you're producing something for someone else to consume, then it's totally like, if I'm like a credit card provider, I want to target as wide audience as possible. But I also want developer happiness, because the problem is like the further down you go, the less new shiny features you can use. So that's like sometimes the scale, like what's my reach and what do I want, like willing to support. But if I'm if I'm an open source package, it can be like I will be on the latest LTS because that's the only thing I have the resource to support. Or it can be like I have a JSON serializer that I maintain that still targets .NET 2.0 because that's what some Unity developers use, because that's the purpose of that package is to fill a specific need. So I mean, like for me personally, like if there's your team's package that you use internally, then I would like have as few monikers as possible for what you need, so you don't bloat the package. Because if you pick multiple, like I want to force .NET 6, .NET 7, .NET, that will mean that you will have multiple DLLs in your package. Also, one alternative is that since like a couple of years ago back, you can have source code packages, which can actually be a really good thing to have if you are just part, like providing code to. Then it will be compiled into your application. So that's something we often use at my work, because that means we don't care about the moniker as long as the code compiles, and then you can have if-defs to say like if it's a 3.1 thing, then we can just commit this code out or something like this. And that's really powerful, because then people will be able to single step into that code. It will be read only in Visual Studio, but it's still available to look at download. So that's also an option, because then it's like as long as the code compiles, it will be, and then you can pick. It can be either any, which as a moniker for source code packages, which it will target any, or it can be for specifics. You can have like for 3.1, I will pick this source file, and for 6, I will pick these source files. So those like. So I think it depends on the audience of your product, and often with with Cake we do have a build tool, and that requires the SDK to be in place, which means that currently we target 3.1, 5.0, and 6.0. Now like 5.0 was out of support in May, so our next major version will drop 3.1, 5.0, and target 6 and 7, because those are the things that are used by our audience, because they will have that SDK installed because they're developers. So I think it all depends on like what's the reach you want for, and how much the burden you want your team to maintain it, because like you want the latest features if you can, and sometimes you can even use the new features if you compile with a new SDK, because some new features are compiler magic and not. They haven't changed the actual assemblies or .NET, and say it's just tooling. So that's something like, so it doesn't mean even if you're targeting .NET 6 or Net Standard 2.1 or 2.0. But for me at this point, Net Standard is pretty pointless, because it's going out like either you target .NET 6 or something newer. But that's for most projects, I think that's the most what you device, because that was supported this .NET 6. I mean, it depends. It could be that you want to support SQL Server, or then you need to go to framework and things like that. So it depends.
So I asked this question on Twitter like months ago, and that was, does Net Standard make sense today? Is there a point to it today, right? And so people smarter than me answered, because I was asking from an honest place, and so people smarter than me answered, and they were like, if you're targeting apps, for instance, that run on Xamarin, and not Maui, but like Xamarin, right? And you want your stuff to, let's say, run on ASP.NET and then Xamarin and then UWP and all these different places, then Net Standard still makes sense to support like those types of workloads. And I was like, okay, you know what, like that makes sense for me. But for me, I'm not in that space. Like, not to say I don't care about them. Rodney is. I care about Rodney, right? Not to say I don't care about them, but it's the fact of the matter is, like, I don't spend a lot of time interfacing and interacting with like mobile folks. I interact with like a lot of web and cloud folks, right? So like those are the people that would be my consumers, so to speak. And now when you think about, hey, well, if this thing becomes like a public internet package versus like an internal package, now that's something I should think about, right? What's going to happen when they pull it in and they're like, oh, hey, like we pulled this in and it's Net Standard and it won't run on Xamarin, and whatever the case is, right? Like you have to think about these things as you're like designing your packages and trying to figure out who, like you said, like who's the possible audience for this thing.
Yeah, but also like if no one raises an issue on a repo for Net Standard, then don't add it. I mean, like sometimes, like I think someone's like people preemptive say this is an issue, but like, is it actually an issue for you? Like sometimes, like add it if the needs arises, or it could even be that you publish parts of the package as a net standard. Like it could be what I need. Well, everyone needs the contracts or the classes or whatever. Well, then that package could be whatever and something like that. But also, like, you need it if you currently, I think, if you're doing like Roslyn analyzers or things, that is still like, it could be that if you target certain toolings, it could be you still need that standard. So it could be like, but I mean, if you don't need it at the moment, add it when you need it. Or like, and just ask why, because some people raise issues and they don't have even a use case. Like, it's more like, why not this? And like, yeah, why not this? Like, sometimes you can almost turn that back as a question, like, why do you need this? What's the like, it's because everything, if you target something, is a burden. Like, you will lose new features, or you will add compile time because you're adding a target. You will add complexity in your DevOps pipeline because you will download 2 SDKs instead of 1. And so, I mean, there's always like a price to pay to you. But it also sometimes can be like an engineering challenge, because like one of like the lit.json, the CLI have, like, I think it targets 8 or 9 TFMs. And that's almost like why I'm doing this myself, but that can be almost like an engineering exercise, like how can we build this? And that can also be a good thing, like if you're a .NET Framework developer today, you can still use the new SDKs, which is, I think, not everyone knows. You can still use the new project formats, so you can gradually migrate and modernize your application. Like, there's no reason, like, so you can still use the new .NET SDK, you can use Azure DevOps or GitHub or whatever, even if you're on the old project. So, I mean, many of the practices you can still use. And I think sometimes people forget that you don't need to stay all old. You can actually target, and Visual Studio and or .NET SDK is smart enough, like, you're targeting this framework, then these features will work. But you will still get all the benefits of the, like, a simpler, you don't have to have the, like, the packages config or things like that. So, I mean, sometimes you can gradually prepare for the new things. And even if you, like, you can be at you run your unit test with a new framework, even if you don't release it, just to see, does it still work, and things like that. So that's certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
So you also brought up something else earlier that I definitely want to go back and touch on, right? So you talked about the difference between build and release.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, I don't know anything about DevOps, right? And my question is it's all just a binary, right? It doesn't matter, like a build, release. You know, there's schools of thought that have, you know, specifically in the mobile space, where it's like build it once, build your application binary, crack open your binary, re-sign the binary, and then deploy it everywhere you need to deploy it, right?
Yeah.
That in the container world probably is not as big of a thing. So what is this distinction between build and release, and what, like, how does the runtime and SDK conversation play into that? Like, do I need to download all the SDKs that it's going to compile against and all the runtimes it's going to run against just to build my code, or is that a release concern?
Well, yes. You need now. What the thing is, like, if you're going to build, you will probably download all the SDKs you need or have them on the build agent. But if you ship a container, then you, like, the end result should only be like what's needed to run that code.
Right.
So you shouldn't ship like, I think before when we had virtual machines and servers that we had like pets, then was like as many dependencies as I can, because then my code will work. Like, I want the vicious like C++ runtime, and I want this and that, and like as much possible, because then I won't have a hassle. I think it's more in the container world. It's like, I will try my code and add things only as needed until it runs. So, I mean, it should be more defensive there in dependencies you add. But also, like, how you service it depends on, like, like you still should only build it once if you have a backend service and you have like a development environment, a staging environment, a production environment. You don't want to rebuild that container during the release. You only want to build it once and have like things like environment variables or key vaults, whatever. That's only the configuration or the environment that changes between, because then otherwise all the testing, sometimes that's hard in the mobile world because you actually need to have a new version number for different deployment tools and things like that. But I mean, generally what you want is an untouched binary for each stage of your release. And that's why you generally want to test it with the same. And the advantage with the container is that it will be the same set of native binaries, and it will be the same set of things. But some things some things are complicated with containers, because even if you're like, the thing that you can't set to forget for 3 years is because, well, the underlying runtime might change. Yes. And that's a big thing, like people don't know with the container, is that you actually share the kernel space with the host, which means if the kernel is updated, it can break the containers because it needs to be this like in sync. So there can be things like that are, and the same thing can be said for PaaS services like as functions. You are dependent on the runtime you're deploying to. Even if you're shipping self-contained like an Avro process function, you're still like that. You don't know what kind of runtime, so you still need to test and redeploy and do things like that. So it can be set to forget in that way, and how you service it depends on how you release it. So you can release the .NET application now as a standalone binary, which has the framework and everything within it. But you can also ship with either like your binary or runtime. And the advantage there is that you can, like with containers, you can reuse parts. You can cache like the runtime, so we'll only pull down your code, so it will be quicker to release. And so that's, but it can also be. That's and essentially that's more like with the native is more like you do it with a Samurai app, because then the whole .NET and everything will be shipped for your and I mean, it's really interesting when we looked at like the Unity developers, because they, like if you say game developers, they seem to pick their stack where they start developing the game, and then they don't change it until they start a new game. And that's interesting from a servicing point with like if there's an exploit and things like that, but also I can see they're so invested, and for them they will be there's so much testing going on, and testing on the mobile space is very expensive. So many are like, it's almost like we take the risk for a business reward or things. But for me, I think if you do backend services, something like you shouldn't be. There's no safe place, and it's very expensive if you're owned or hacked and it comes up like. You want to avoid that, and the thing is like because you ship the code usually now, it's your responsibility to serve this code. You don't get it on the Windows machine or Windows Update or whatnot. But the advantage is that you can actually test that code. You know what's on the machine. It was really troublesome before when they don't have that C++ runtime on their machine, or they don't have .NET. They have 4.6 and not 4.6.2, and things dependent. So I mean, it has both good points and hard parts. But it also means that if you do a native compilation, it will only. But before you know that idle code would run on any Windows machine or not. Now it can be like it's only x86 or x64 or ARM. You can, if you combine, and that's almost the same problem as you had the experience from the mobile space. Like I compile for this platform, or I do some kind of multi-binary or universal binary, but it's still multiple complications if you want that kind of thing. So they made it more complicated in one way on Microsoft now, especially with the like it's easier now when they have essentially you have two monikers to care of if you're in the data space. You have essentially the current and the next to care more, but there's always this like overlap thing. But it's become a lot better. It was very painful in the NetCore 2.1 area 2.0 because they changed the tooling and the product formats and everything. But it's been very stable. It's more additive now and very well tested. And I think, like Scott Hunter said, like in a recent podcast I listened to, is like there's no quality difference between an LTS and a STS. They have the same requirements, the same integration testing, the same release process, because for them it needs to have the same quality.
Right.
And also what we see in sometimes with Microsoft is that one of the like disadvantages, like 3.1 hasn't gotten any, it's only service releases likely. So if it's like some bug fixes might not be important enough to reach 3.1, even if it's a bug, which means you need to go to a newer version to get that kind of thing. So it's, I mean, there's no guarantee with this like support cycle sometimes with the people see. So I think, at least I think it's important to test your code regular with a new thing, because then you know, will I have, and you can do a calculated thing and see like, what do we need to do to get here? Or it's more like it's, if you have been on one path for 3 years and then like, oh, the world has changed, then you're like in for a ride, or you might not be there because your code might not run. But I mean, it all depends on what situation you're in, because it can be, there have been some bumpy rides with like the cloud things, like with Azure Functions, they had like the out of process thing and in process was 2 different runtimes they had. And the problem there was like with 3.1, it was the improc thing. And with 5.0, they had out, like .NET 5.0, they had the auto processing, but they were different things. Then they released 6.0, which supported both runtimes, but now they have 7, and it only supported autoproc initially. And so sometimes it can be that, well, I need to be on 6 because my dependencies keep me there. And that's sometimes which is good to know, just to try to build your code, because actually it can be, it's not your problem, it can be your dependencies holding you back. And that's good information to know, because if your dependencies is from some large company with a slow release cycle, you want as early as possible to flag that we're seeing issues with this, because they might not be as vigilant or try with new things. So it might be a big process to just start those wheels to turn. So that's also like just to be educated. And I mean, I'm like, you shouldn't be reckless. You shouldn't just like, I'm upgrading anything, I'm just changing the moniker here and ship it and hope for the best. You should still be an engineer, test it, measure, see if there's improvements. It can be like part of your, like you can have regressions in performance, and that'd be like, well, if I'm like a trading software, I can't have that regression. That would be losing money. But it can also be like we saw with .NET 5, like we had like, this would be a cost saver. So it's worth for us because it's so more efficient. So we can have 10% more containers running at the same time. And that's like in the cloud world, that's like that's dollars and like saved. So it can be something like it's worth it to have some pain, to have a better building discussion, because that's something you notice in the cloud, like they will scale for you, but your wallet won't scale at the same after sometimes.
You know, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rodney.
Go ahead.
So as you're talking, one of the things that's always been in the back of my mind is, again, like the culture has changed and like we've gone to this yearly release cycle. I want to ask an opinionated question to both of you. And do you all think that is too fast for .NET folks? Like, do you think that is a comfortable cadence, or are we going too fast? Are we going too slow? I have my opinions about it, but I'd love to hear what y'all think about like the cadence of the release cycle, because obviously the cadence affects everything, right? Like it affects how we deploy and what we put in our builds and what we test on and yada, yada, yada. So I'd love to hear what y'all think about that.
It's kind of like the word of the day thing, right? Like you literally hit the nail. And the reason why we're here is because in my world, I still know people that are running, .NET 4.5 in production applications. And this whole new world where we have this, Microsoft has adopted, a real release cadence. It's no longer shipping every 3 years on CDs or every 5 years on CDs, right? So like now we can take advantage of things like containers, which we didn't have before. So in my opinion, it's too fast for some of the large corporations because their cycles aren't as they have and this is an excuse, but it's not a good thing. They take so much time to release their software because their processes are so slow and clunky and antiquated that they can't take advantage of this new release cycle. So my concern is once everyone is on the new MAUI and is now officially everyone's on .NET 6 Plus, let's just put a line in the sand and call it .NET 6. .NET 6 Plus, it's going to be a really, really big culture shock for a lot of companies because they can't just set they can't set the framework for 3 years and come back to it later. They have to deal with it.
Yeah. And I see like sometimes like I've seen applications that haven't gotten a lot of love for 10 or 20 years. That's like reality in some. And if you look at some things, that's been a really cheap application because you did the testing once and then it's been like stable in one way. But the problem is you will have a real hard time for one moment to find new developers because who would want to work there? And then you will end up in a what I've seen is that you end up in a project where you have the original developer isn't there anymore because he left, or she left, or they left. I have said like I've seen whole teams leave and there's only consultants left. The problem is like then you end up with code that no one dares to touch, and then you will lose features and you will essentially we will be probably a competitor will own us in a way. So we like the only thing we can do now is probably to have some kind of sales things and be bought out and then put out of our misery essentially like that project. So that's like the problem. But there's sometimes like mathematics can be like it's really cheap if I do no servicing and but it's the same with the car. Like I can skip the mileage service on my car, but it could also be one day that it's just stopped on the highway and it will no longer live. It's dead. And that's like, well, I saved $1 each year, but it will be a real expensive. So that's almost the analogy, like something like so. But I mean, you shouldn't be reckless. You shouldn't just push things out. You should test it, and you should. But I think it's important to have the knowledge in the team. What technical depth do we have? And it should be a discussion you have like. Well, for us, it makes sense to be on 4.6, whatever, because we are on ATM and we are in a hidden environment and it's embedded and whatever, and we will do something else. Then it's a calculated risk. And then I think that's like all your debt you should be aware of, and you should have what's my payment plan for a debt. Then it's something at least you have thought through the processes and like this is the business need and whatever. But I mean, but at the same time, we had a big grocery shop here that was hacked. And that day, when you're on the news and your personal information of all your customers leaked out, then you're no more. So, I mean, you can always value, like, it's cheap to do nothing, but it can also be like a ticking time bomb. I mean, it's sometimes you can do it partly. Like, even if you're targeting .NET Framework, you can still use the new tooling, like the latest Visual Studio, you can use, because that's something like the really scary thing I see about some companies is where they don't even update the developers' machines. They don't have a new operating system, the latest Visual Studio, SDKs and things like that. And that means that you have a unicorn developer environment because you have a developer environment that no one else has. And you don't even know how that, like if you like had a fire, you wouldn't know how to build your software because those like you have, I need Visual Studio 2003 with these things on it. So that's also like there's so many aspects to being responsible and maintaining, and that's something like the GDPR here in Europe with the privacy things has been a good way because it actually has been something that tangible that management will understand, and that's how you need to sell it to men. Like you shouldn't be that like dogmatic and saying your manager is an idiot and why don't you understand what I understand, because that's not a good sell. But if you can say like we will be cheaper in the cloud, or if you can say we will be secure, or we will not have this privacy incident, or we will develop features faster, that is something that management will understand and will give you probably time to. If you don't do, well, there's plenty of jobs out there. Like I'm hiring developers and many are out. Like you can find new jobs as a developer today. So I mean, you should, but you shouldn't be dogmatic about it. You should be engineer and say like these are the reasons we should do upgrade. These are the steps, and there are also ways where I really like, but like if you look at the new with Jarf, the new reverse proxy which ships with .NET, you can actually do things like do both have your old web and the new web running in the same at the same time, which means that you can gradually, responsively like strangle parts of the application piece by piece until you're new. Like it's so easy for developers. Like I pick the latest package, and I will pick the latest thing and do the big rewrite each time. You still have to be responsible with the business's money.
Yeah, I think like when I think about the cadence, and I have to think about the question too, like what is .NET in my head, and I look at the release, and it's not just the runtime that releases a new version every year. There's a new version of ASP.NET. There's a new version of C#. There's a new F# thing. I'm sure whenever Maui gets in line, like there'll be a new Maui thing. Like there's a new version of a thing, of multiple things that are like inside of that one bucket. And even though for a long time we heard, oh, .NET is not tied to Visual Studio, there's always a new Visual Studio release every time there's a .NET release. It's just kind of the way the world works, right? Yeah. And so for me, like when those releases happen, again, like it's not a small incremental change. Like the world changes literally, like when you get a new version, because you're like, okay, well, I gotta get this new version of Visual Studio, and it has the new templates, and now and this language feature only works in this and that, and I'm like, there's so much moving parts, like so many moving things that I have to think about when I think about, okay, let me upgrade to the new version, let me move my team, or let me push my package, right? And so for me, I would love, I don't work there, so I can say this, I would love if, hey, can we just push, again, let's push the runtime every year, but like, do we really need a new version of C# every year? Like, do we really need it? I don't. No, we don't. Like, I'd question that, right? Like, do we really need a new? I don't know. Like, does ASP.NET need to come out every time that .NET core version of .NET comes? Like, do we really need to do that? Like, I don't know. I don't really think so. So for me, I get it. Like, if the runtime updates and changes and things happen on that perspective, like, sure, release it every 6 months. I don't care. Whatever. Like, we'll figure it out, right? But then when we think about like those higher level pieces that sit on top of it, that also churn at that same rate, now I'm just like, all right, hold on, buddy. Like, let's slow down a little bit, because there's a lot of other things that this is affecting now.
Yeah, and I think the problem with C# is the problem there is like as soon as it needs a runtime update, then when we're in trouble with features. There was so much with a lot of things from, like, if you look from .NET 2 to like almost 4, 5 something, was more like the compiler features worked on any runtime because it was still essentially the same IL that it produced. The problem when we came to like .NET Core is that they changed things in the runtime and forgot about, and that's sometimes wording also with I see something with Microsoft and things like the newest features come in the latest version, but they don't backport it, which means you need to jump to, like, sometimes it would be nice to be able to ease into things and still target, and some features do, but often it's unsupported and things like that. So that's the problem sometimes with long cycles. If it's 3 years, it can be a cliff in that kind of way. But also it's really interesting to see like it's hard to know what's the best practice at the moment, because like, what does C# look today? What would be, because sometimes Microsoft is really like, you can do whatever you want. I'm like, yeah, but sometimes my team wants guidance. But and I think like Bill Wagner has done good things with Docs now and the whole Learn thing, but I was like, because you almost need like the C# you wrote like with 1.0, .NET 1.0 isn't the same you write today. It's almost a different language in many aspects. You can still compile 1.0 C# with a new, but it's not the best practice. Like you have, and some things are like so. Like one of my favorite things that has come a couple of years is actually records, because it has reduced so many errors in code, because it solves the nullability problem, because they are initialized by default. They have a constructor that's always initialized. They have things like you can easily copy them with the with syntax and just change those things. And so that was like some that can be, but the problem is when we got features and you can't use for all projects, it means you have a diversion. So like there's a line in the sand, and that's the problem with language features. Like sometimes it'd be nice if things compile and it's clear what compiles for each language. And that's something like I've seen, like there's and the problem like now we're also multi-platform. They can be you actually need to go to the newer version because, well, now Ubuntu changed which libc version they ship. And that's like for .ml, what libc? I don't even know what that thing is. It's like a libc.oo file. Like I don't care about that. That should something that Microsoft should just work. And that's something you also see a big difference from the .NET Core 1.0 versus .NET 6 and 7 is that more and more things ship within the runtime, because they took some, like, they couldn't rewrite everything to support multi-platform, which means in the beginning, like, we used this certificate store, or we used this date thing, or we used that for localization. But you also see more and more coming within the framework, which make it easier to be portable. Because, if you have dependencies, those are out of control of Microsoft. And that's a problem sometimes, like a zip prescription. But and that's like, it can be a really hard awakening, like when your cloud shifts from Ubuntu 20.04 to 22.04 and nothing works, and you're like, what do I do? And that's why it's nice to like test things to just see, oh, it doesn't work. And it's nicer to have that. And when the problem with cloud is sometimes they shift for you. Usually you get the grace period, and then they will just hard shift to the new version. And if you haven't done the work, then you will be in trouble, because then your service doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like a matrix, right? Like there's so many like different edges and corners and things that you have to think about as you're trying to like navigate, should I upgrade, right? Which sounds like an easy thing to say, right? But when you actually look at all the information and you put it in front of you and you analyze it, like there's so many different perspectives, right, that you have to consider before you're like, yes, let me click next, okay on the installer, right, and have this thing put on my machine. So I guess, and we're starting to get closer to the end. One of the things I'd want to ask you now is, so for the space that you're in, how do you think about like automating some of these things? Like you've talked about doing it, but like, what are some of the tools you actually use to do it, right? Because I think what would be helpful for folks is to know, okay, sure, I can automate this thing, I can test this thing, but like with what, right? Like, what are the things that you use, like that are in your toolbox that help you kind of, make these things kind of work comfortably for you?
Yeah, and as I said previously, I'm a DevOps person, so I want to automate as much as possible, because that means that I won't forget to run that test or that thing. Then there are some really good tools. Like if you look, like Simon Kropp has done Verify, which is a snapshot testing tool. It has a lot of things, not just for assertions, but it also has UI testing. So you can do things like playwright or automated UI, because that can be also something which is something like if the MAUI changes something slightly, like a padding or things. That is something that you won't notice when you compile, but your customers will notice that sometimes, and you don't want your customer to know. And that's why it's nice to do. It can do snapshot testing with like screenshots and do diff compares and binary like. So I think it's important to have like both like integration testing, which is automated, so you actually run your code and see it, but also have things like unit tests is important too. But for cloud services, sometimes end-to-end testing is the only thing that will keep things live, and that's something that you truly need to automate. I think with a thing. That I think so. It's important to have some kind of CI tooling, and the good thing about CI tooling is that it's really easy to shift out what's the base container I'm using, what's the data framework I'm using, because you have a recipe for how you're building your code, which means it's much easier to just like change the global JSON and do a restore and see does it still work. And that's easy to automate in my way. Then if you're a MAUI developer, there's things like App Center or Test Cloud or things that I think it's important to have so you get like someone that canary in the coal mine. That's something, because you can't test everything. It's easier if you do backend stuff. It's much easier because it's low risk, and that's why for me, like if I'm doing backend services, it's like if I can just pick that background worker, upgrade that, and test that, then it's really easy to roll back. But also like a good thing, like if I want to try .NET 7 and I have one function or one endpoint, try it with that, because then it's like you will still have most of the .NET code that you've written can just copy that into a .NET 6 project or something like that. But it will also be easy to, like, you know what should be going into that, and you also know what's going out. So you can almost do like a unit test, but for that API and things like that. So you know what things. I think that's and then you can use like things like the API testing or just scripting. I think that's important that you have some smoke testing when you release things. But also you can do things like if you have it's really like have feature flags is important, because then you can have like 80-20 rules, like 20% of my thing goes to this new feature and 80% goes this, and you can have things like the Azure Mono thing, or if you have Raygun or whatever you have to actually measure things. And that's the really important thing, because you can't be everywhere. So logging is really important. And it's also important to have just things like using tailored exceptions is really important, because then you can pinpoint problem and find them. Don't just use the exception type. Use the file not found if not file not found, so you can find that needle in the haystack. So monitoring is really important. So you can both measure things like asserts and exceptions and things like that, but also metrics like how much memory I'm using. That's really important if I'm switching runtime. Like, how does my application behave? Then it's important to have metrics like how much memory I'm using, what kind of resources I have, and that's what something we saw when we switched to .NET 5. We switched on the RC2 for some services, because our memory footprint was so much lower that it made economical business sense to switch over to it. But we shouldn't. But we still measured before, because some things regressed. Like we had some regional settings thing that, or something which often, if you're a non-US person, you will break stuff just by being outside of the US, because you have funny characters or funny dates or things like that. So that's things that you need to test, because it can be. But also, if you find it early, you can influence Microsoft or influence them. Because one thing I also learned is that they're really interesting to get feedback in the beginning when they release something. And at the end of support cycle, it's not as hot for them important. So it's good sometimes with trying new stuff. And that's why I often try like have the try new like almost use everything in the latest function thing, because then I know that's the supported thing. Because if they're going to bug fix it, they won't bug fix the old version, they will bug fix a new version. Yeah. But automation is key, I think, and also like have external witnesses, like have some service that monitoring your thing, or have an external service or people that test your code or whatever.
Because I'm guessing too, once you have that automation infrastructure already set up, now when you think about testing version +1, now it's just a matter of like adding it to, I guess, like your list.
It's a parameter to your pipeline,
right?
So it's essentially like it's and that's why, like, I think it's really important to move things like configuration out of your binaries and have it externally. Have feature flags externally of your code, which means you can toggle them in runtime if something happens or that, and also can have that same like untouched binaries. You know, is it the runtime or is it my code? If you have to rebuild things, you don't know if it's the build process or the runtime or my code that broke. So sometimes it's nice to be able to test with a known thing to be able to see, is it the compiler bug or is it this or that? Then you need to have the confidence in that. And that's why it's really good to have know that there are things where you can set a couple of environment variables to force it to roll forward, even if you haven't recompiled things. There's our NuGet packages to polyfill, so you can use new features with old target manufacturers. So that can be something for like if it's only this thing that holds me back to upgrade. It can be things like that. But automation is key, I think, and also cadence, because I notice sometimes with SSL certificates, people forget to renew them. But if you renew every 3 months, that's why something with cadence, because people forget. They will. If you only do things every 3 months, the knowledge will be lost what it was, the process that was to upgrade. If you do something every month, you will have that knowledge kept within the team because you did it recently. So sometimes problems with intervals, if they're too far, people will have forgotten the pain they saw in that 3 years ago because they didn't know what they did last Friday even. So.
You know, it sounds like we need to have an episode where we talk about automation and DevOps. So Rodney, you and I, we're gonna have to figure that out, and that sounds like that'll be a really interesting stream to show folks, and particularly too, like let's kind of like walk folks through like what does this actually look like. But we're gonna have to do it another day. We're not gonna do that today. Matthias, I just want to say thank you for coming on. This has been great.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is really good conversation. Yeah, and I learned a lot, because again, always great to have folks smarter than me to tell me about.
Yeah, it's always nice to have there's no security. There's no safe place. There's like you only know what you know. There's
exactly
because sometimes I think people, especially management, they go into it's like if we don't touch things, they're safe, but they still need to be thinking about things and being an architect and engineer and that kind of thing. And I think there's a false sense of safety sometimes when you're like, oh, I can just pick this horse and never touch it. And that's I think it's important to have this. Even if you choose something else, your depth should be calculated within your team. And you should have and the most important thing is have a blameless culture. I think if something happens, learn from it. And that's because things will happen. And if you don't blame people, just have sit down. What happened? How can we avoid this? And if you have small catastrophes, small mistakes each day, then there's no problem to come I did this. Well, we will solve this and work together. The problem is if you have a big mistake, then you might not be able to recover from it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Make those mistakes and also document them, right? Yeah. Document them, write them down, so there's a knowledge base or a wiki or a company thing that I could go to and I could see, oh, okay, we did this before, let's not do it again, right? And kind of grow and evolve from there. Cool. Well, gentlemen, this has been fun, man. Like I said, appreciate both of you, and all of you that are still watching, appreciate you too. And I hope you all join us again next week, week after that, and the week after that, as many times as you want to join us, as we talk about more things happening in the world of .NET. So that being said, thank you all so much, and I guess we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.